Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. In 1992, scientists discovered a new mammal species in the Annamite Mountains in Vietnam called saola. But as quickly as this animal, which looks like an antelope with exquisitely long horns, became known to science, it disappeared again. Saola has never been seen by any biologist in the wild, and there are only a few photos of it from camera traps. Saola was last camera trapped in 2013 in Vietnam, and since then there are only occasional reports from villagers who claim to have seen it. It's estimated that fewer than 50 to 100 saolas survive in the wild. Searching for saola seems like an insurmountable task, but a newly formed nonprofit, Saola Foundation for Annamite Mountains Conservation, is determined to find the animal and save it. Today, I'm talking to William Robichaud, the president of the organization, about the importance of saving saola and the Annamite Mountains, the challenges of finding the animal, and about their 2-year intensive search plan. Bill, saola was first discovered in 1992. Why so late?
That's a good question, and I think part of the reason may have had to do with the Vietnam War, for example. So, the American War. Vietnamese say it was the American War, not the Vietnam War. But that war that went on, that was, and the French, had their own war in Indochina in the 1950s. So it was a dangerous place to be running around the Annamite Mountains from, the 1960s into the early 1970s. That's part of the reason, I think. There weren't biological surveys, during that period. But it's also still surprising because, Laos and Vietnam was part of a French colony for 100 years, and there were French biologists there doing various surveys. They never came across saola. After Laos and Vietnam became communist in 1975 at the end of the war, a lot of Russian technical advisors were invited in to help rebuild the countries. And I talked to the great Russian ornithologist years later, Vladimir Flint, and he said, yeah, Bill, we Russians were so surprised. We were also doing biological surveys in Vietnam and Laos in the 1980s, and we never found saola. So it's a bit, because the animal is so distinctive, it doesn't look like anything else in Southeast Asia. It's not something you could easily miss if you saw it. It's still surprising. So I think at the end of the day, it hasn't been very common. It was never even very common when it was discovered in 1992. And it lives in, quite remote, densely forested mountain habitat where not a lot of people go and can get to. So it was an interesting combination of circumstances and certainly a surprise. This was probably the most surprising zoological discovery of the 20th century.
And how did you contribute to the discovery of this animal?
Not at all. I was sitting in a little cafe having a coffee in Laos in 1992. I was there doing some bird surveys, and I got a copy of the English language Bangkok Post up from Thailand, and I opened it up, and there was this picture of this biologist, John McKinnon, holding these spectacular long horns, and WWF announcing to the world the discovery of this new large mammal. And there was a little map in the news story showing where the discovery was made in Vu Quang Nature Reserve in Vietnam. And it's right on the Laos border. And so I looked at that map. I said, oh gosh, this animal almost certainly occurs in Laos. So within a day or two, I was on a bus down to that part of Laos across the border, walking around the forest. Of course, I didn't find the saola.
So that's how your fascination with the animal started, right? With saola.
Yeah, so my early career was all in birds, mainly birds of prey. I've been studying birds of prey since I was a teenager, and I did degrees in zoology around birds of prey. And then I I did bird surveys in Laos, and then I was hired by the Wildlife Conservation Society, based at the Bronx Zoo in New York, to coordinate a new conservation program that they were starting in Laos, working with the Lao government. And I was coordinating our team to help the Lao government survey national protected areas in Laos, just for find out what wildlife might be in these areas. And when Saola was discovered, I just kept expecting somebody to come and take over saola conservation, because large mammals weren't my area of expertise. And nobody ever did. In fact, the great biologist George Schaller, who worked for WCS, he came to Laos and did like a survey for saola. And I said to him, George, you've defined your career and you're famous for being the first Westerner to go into some remote place and study an animal that's never been studied. He was the first Westerner to study giant panda in China and the first Westerner to study tigers in the wild and Serengeti lions and jaguars. And I said, why aren't you making saola your retirement project? Why aren't you just settling down? And he said, how do you study an animal? It's so hard to see. And I've got work in the Tibetan plateau and I'm going back there. So it feels like saola, I didn't choose saola, it's like saola chose me. I did have a very significant experience of connection with the animal when I was in Laos. Shortly after I arrived, within a month of arriving there to work for WCS, an adult female saola was captured by villagers in January of 1996 in central Laos. And it was purchased by a general in central Laos who had a little small zoo, a private zoo, and he put it in the zoo. And just by kind of good luck circumstances, I learned about this within 24 hours. And like the next day, I was down there watching this animal. And I spent the next 3 weeks with this adult female saola, watching her and just taking notes on her behavior. Because it was the first adult saola ever seen by the outside world. She died after 18 days. I don't know why. She didn't have professional zoo care. She was just being taken care of by the general's staff, and they didn't know anything about taking care of large animals. I had no control over what they did. I just could watch it, but that was all. But I think and she was just amazing. She was incredibly tame around people, which is true of a lot of these forest ungulates, like Sumatran rhino, for example. I've spent more time with a saola than maybe almost any human, but a few villagers. So I developed an emotional connection to the animal through that, probably. And that's why it feels like I didn't really pick saola. Just, the universe picked it for me or something. Hard to say. So.
And you've been dedicated to it for so many years. And I'm wondering, why is the saola population so small, and has it always been like this?
Well, no, it's not always been this small. There's been a massive decline in saola since it was discovered, and that's mainly due. It was probably never common, but it was certainly a lot more common than it is now when it was discovered in 1992. And what's happened is there were some socioeconomic changes in Vietnam. It's not quite clear the reason, but I think it had something to do with some economic liberalization, in the communist state of Vietnam, such that there's been an explosion in the commercial wildlife trade since about 1994, the early 1990s. And this went from almost nothing to a huge explosion in the trade. And it's been driven mainly by the demands of animals valued in traditional Asian medicine, and also bushmeat restaurants, because like wild meat, like in Europe, it's more expensive than domestic meat. But this really started ramping up in the early 1990s, just about the time the saola was discovered. Saola itself really isn't specifically targeted because it never occurred in China, so there's no use for it in traditional Chinese medicine. But so many other animals have traditional use in medicine or are valued for restaurants. So for the medicinal things, all primates have value. Their bones are considered good medicine for various things. All cats have value. Pangolins. almost anything you can think of. So what happened is the Vietnamese figured out that they could catch these animals by setting wire leg hold snares. So they make these wire snare traps out of wire cable. It's the cable that's used like in bicycles for the brake cable or the gear cable. And they started setting these by the thousands in the Annamite Mountains in Vietnam. And then they came across to Laos, and they taught Lao villagers how to use these snares. And they gave them the wire and said, all right, we'll come back every few weeks and buy whatever you've snared. And this has been a catastrophe in the last 25 or 30 years for all wildlife populations moving on the ground in the Annamite Mountains. Saola is still hanging on, but it's been caught up in the general slaughter of all this snaring.
But the strange thing is that the demand wasn't there before they started this. So where did the people get those wildlife products from before, or why did it suddenly boost so much?
So one thing, people became more prosperous. Now they suddenly had money in places like Hanoi, to buy wildlife, which is very expensive. Plus, they were also able to establish private businesses and trading companies and things like that. And also, Veronica, you often read in development reports by, well-meaning agencies like the World Bank or the United Nations, and it's a common thing to read in these development reports about conservation in Southeast Asia that one of the drivers of biodiversity loss is poverty. These people don't have enough to eat and they're killing animals in the forest. That is complete nonsense. The main driver of biodiversity loss in Southeast Asia is wealth. It's the incredible wealth now in China, it's the incredible wealth in the urban centers of Hanoi and Vientiane that's driving the wildlife trade. Yeah, there's poor people out in the villages supplying the trade, but the main problem is wealth. And it's not that China shouldn't be wealthy and people in Vietnam shouldn't be wealthy, but that is the driver. For example, a Lao villager, he can, up in the mountains in the Annamites, he might earn a couple $1,000s every year in cash, because they're not in a cash economy. They're in a self-sufficiency economy. They forage food, they grow their own food. So they might earn a couple $1,000s a year in cash from selling an extra water buffalo or some extra rice. 5 or 6 years ago, and I bet the price is higher, a villager could sell a single rare box turtle in the genus Kiora to a Vietnamese trader for $25,000 in cash for one turtle that weighs 1 kilogram. And by the time this guy trades it up to somebody in Hanoi, and by the time they trade it into China, this animal is believed to cure cancer, and by the time some wealthy guy in China dying of cancer buys it, he might be paying $100,000 for this turtle. So it's that, it's the wealthy buying this stuff.
You're totally right, because I did an interview with a guy called Arthur Sniegoń, and he tries to protect elephants in Central Africa, and it's exactly the same thing. The people to blame are not the poor people who kill the elephants. They're only doing it because of the demand, and the demand for the ivory and for the bushmeat is the rising middle class, and most importantly, the demand that comes from Vietnam and China. So yeah.
And the world over, the poor don't have a voice, so they're easy to blame. And also, some of the solutions are ineffective because, say, we'll go in and we'll, plant fruit trees for the villagers or extra rice paddies so they have an alternative source of income. Well, you're never going to do enough of that where a villager would not still pick up and sell a turtle worth $25,000. You can have all the alternative income in the world. You're still going to do that because the prices are so high. So it's these very high prices that has driven commercial professional wildlife poachers into every corner of the Annamites looking for any animal they can find with any value. If the issue was just local people occasionally hunting saola for food, the animal would not be critically endangered today. It's the commercial wildlife trade just sweeping up saola, with all the snares, that's the issue. It's not habitat loss. There's still a lot more suitable habitat in forests in the Annamites than there are saola inhabiting those forests.
So I had a question about these snares, So I read in one of the blog posts on your website that in 70 to 90% of saola range, you cannot go 1 kilometer without finding a snare. And the snare can stretch for kilometers. So I was thinking that if there are so many snares, then some of them must have trapped saola. But the thing is that no, there is no evidence of saola in the black market. So does it not mean that saola is extinct?
No, it doesn't. For two things, you're right. It's the black market, meaning it's the market that's not seen. So formerly, for example, in Laos, which I'm most familiar with, formerly you could go into markets and you would see wildlife, for sale in the open, even though it was technically illegal. It was illegal according to law of the wildlife trade, but it was tolerated. Since then, the Lao government, to their credit, and I think the Vietnamese government, they've gotten much better at cracking down on the wildlife trade. There's been a lot of enforcement around wildlife trade. So now it's not in the open anymore. It's gone underground, but it's still going on. The saola that was caught in 2010 was found in a leg hold snare. The reason we're confident it's there, for example, in an area where both the Saola Working Group, which is the technical IUCN technical group on saola, and more recently the Saola Foundation, but especially the Saola Working Group, has been doing a lot of camera trapping in a protected area that we think has high potential for saola, called Kunze no Ma. It's in Laos, right on the border with Vietnam. And in Kunze no Ma, we don't have any camera trap photographs of saola, despite a fair bit of effort, but we know there are gaur in there. They've been seen, and gaur is a huge wild cow that, they weigh, 800 kilos. They're massive. We don't have any camera trap photographs of gaur. And it's not hard to get camera trap photographs of gaur if you know they're there. Another thing is a very large wild pheasant called crested argus. They're almost the size of a peacock or a peafowl. And they just live on the ground. Very easy to camera trap if they're present, or in theory they should be. When you go into Kunze no Ma in the breeding season, you can hear the male crested arguses calling from many different directions. They're clearly fairly common. We have very few camera trap photographs of crested argus. The problem is, in that habitat, the range of a camera trap is very small because it's very dense, wet, cool forest, and that's not really prime for camera trapping. So, yes, and you're right, some of the ranger teams that have been patrolling haven't found a saola and a snare, but they're not finding anywhere near most of the snares. So who knows? I'm certain that poachers have probably found saolas and their snares, but they're not going to tell anybody about it. They'll just hide it and sell the meat. So yeah, we don't know if saola have been found in snares and how many. It could be quite a few. We just don't know.
Maybe you should become an undercover investigator and ask for saola, and maybe someone will lead you to it. Because that's what the guy is doing or was doing in Central Africa. Trying to break into this chain of illegal trade.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I guess it's much more easier with ivory because there is still relatively a lot of it than compared to saola. But as you said, you were searching for saola in Kunze no Ma. I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing it correctly. Okay, thanks.
That's good.
And since 2017, your organization has led an intensive search for saola using 300 camera traps, and you took that were placed there for over 3 years, and you took 1 million pictures, right? And not one featured saola.
The Annamite Mountains they cover about the same area as the Swiss Alps, if Europeans are familiar with that, or the state of New Jersey, or they're about half. I was just in Denmark. They're about half the area of the country of Denmark. So in this area that large, which is all dense mountain forest, there's fewer than 100 individual animals scattered throughout this forest. Finding them with a camera trap would be very, very difficult. I don't care how many camera traps you have out, unless you have like 500,000. It's going to be very hard to find this animal with a camera trap. So our Saola Foundation technical director, Rob Timmons, and he's been doing surveys for wildlife in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. He's been running around those forests since 1992. He estimates that probably, given the challenges of finding the last saola and looking at how much camera trapping has been done and where, Rob estimates that so far only 10% of the effort in the field needed to find saola has been thus far deployed. So the role of the Saola Foundation, we're going to, in an intensive 2-year program, we're going to fill in that 90% gap. And it's not going to rely on camera trapping. It's going to be relying on methods better suited to find saola than camera trapping. So it's going to be searching for like the dung, the feces of saola, and doing a rapid DNA test, and using dogs to help us find the dung, and then a rapid DNA test, things like that. And that's much more suitable to finding an animal this rare. And remember, things like camera trapping, they're developed and used for studying populations of animals. We're not at that stage for saola. We're finding individual animals. And camera traps are really not the best technology to find an individual animal in a huge forest.
And that's what worries me, because it's only these individuals roaming around this huge area. I also read another or I don't know whether it was on the website or Rob said it, that there can be fewer than 50 saolas. So you said fewer than 100
Right.
or fewer than 50. So how can this population of saolas survive at such a low number? They have to mate. So even though there are individuals, they will die if they don't find a mate and breed successfully.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it was the conclusion when I was coordinator of the Saola working group till 2019. And in conversations we had with the Saola working group, it was concluded that even if you could eliminate all poaching and hunting right now, like overnight, the numbers of saola in the wild were still so low that they would probably still drift to extinction. Because they're called Ali effects, these effects that kick into effect when an animal population gets so small. So like you kind of suggested, males and females can't find each other for breeding anymore. Or you have one typhoon, batters one patch of forest in Vietnam, and you might have killed, 50% of the population just by a chance weather event or things like that. So the conclusion was if that's what you believe, and pretty much all saola conservationists in the world agree, then you have to start a captive breeding program as soon as possible. So the whole focus of the search by the Saola Foundation is to find saolas for a captive breeding program. And this is being supervised and developed by the Saola Working Group under a program the IUCN calls the One Plan Approach, where you don't have some people doing captive breeding and another group trying to preserve the habitat in the wild or reduce the threats in the wild. You integrate those into one plan or one program. And so the Saola Foundation is working to contribute to the IUCN One Plan Approach. The Saola Working Group has been coordinating with the government of Vietnam to develop a saola captive breeding center that'll be situated in the Saola's range at Bac Ma National Park in Vietnam. But of course, a captive breeding center can only have value if you can find animals to put in the captive breeding center. So the Saola Foundation is focused on finding in Laos, where we think it's more likely you can find saola now than in Vietnam, finding some of the last saolas in Laos, so that and finding them in a way that will allow their safe capture for the captive breeding center that's being developed in Vietnam. And we believe it can be done. Yeah, it's going to be difficult, very challenging, but that's what makes it fun. I mean, when you think about it, this is going to be the most important search, the most intensive and important search for any wild animal in recent times.
That's what I wanted to ask you. So, do you know about any other species in other parts of the world that people search for with so much effort?
The one that comes to mind, maybe being an American, is the ivory-billed woodpecker. So this is this spectacular, large woodpecker, I believe in its own genus, that was thought extinct probably for 50 years. And then there were some reported published sightings of it about 15 or 20 years ago in forests in the southern U.S. This stimulated an intensive search for this ivory-billed woodpecker. It's not clear if it's been successful. Possibly it's been successful, but the information is being kept secret. I mean, we don't know. But that's the only thing that I think comes close to the search for the saola is that, you know, an animal that nobody's seen for like years. That's what's interesting about saola. I think you alluded to in your introduction. This is an animal that is highly distinctive. It doesn't look like anything else. It weighs 100 kilograms. No biologist has ever seen this animal in the wild, ever.
And given the size of the population, how much time do you think saolas have left in the wild to survive?
We don't know. Not much. Very little. I mean, it's possible we're too late. We don't know that. It's possible, as they say in English, it's maybe 2 minutes after midnight and it's too late. But it's 2 minutes before midnight. And we have gotten some pushback from, supporters and donors. A few have said, we're no longer going to support this because we don't believe saola still exists, that it's either already extinct in the wild or there aren't enough left to find. And my response to them has been, show me the data on which you're basing that conclusion. Here's our data and our information on, the results of camera trapping and all the good populations of other ground-dwelling animals that still persist in Kunzengoma, like gaur and some of the new barking deers. Based on this data, we conclude there's a good chance there's saola still there. What's your data set that's concluding you to believe that they aren't? And they don't have a data set. They just notice that they haven't picked up a newspaper recently and seen a photograph of announcing a camera trap photograph of saola. So there's just kind of this conclusion that, they must be extinct.
I was thinking that some people could argue that searching for an animal whose population is so tiny and which was seen a decade ago, some people could consider it useless, and they would say that it's better to invest the effort in protecting a different species, for example, as I mentioned, elephants or langurs or any other animal. So what would you say to these people?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's a fair concern. And I would say there's two things. I would say, number one, that assumes there's only a finite money for conservation in the world. That any dollar spent that we can inspire people to spend on saola won't be spent on something else. But I don't believe that's true. The world is full of money. And actually, very little of the world's money is going to wildlife conservation. So one of the Saola Foundation's goals is to actually find new donors to wildlife conservation and get them to invest in saola. So it's not like if we didn't do this, all that money would automatically go to save, rhinos or elephants or something else. I mean, that's not the case at all. Second is the importance of the Annamite Mountains. The Annamite Mountains are extraordinarily important for other species of very rare animals that are found nowhere else in the world. Large antlered muntjac, this new species of barking deer, also critically endangered. The Annamite or Chungson muntjac, this incredible array of beautiful, endemic, rare primates in the Annamite Mountains, like red-shanked Duke-Langer and white-cheeked gibbon. There's all sorts of stuff in the Annamites. It's an extremely important global biodiversity hotspot for larger animals. And a lot of them are under threat for the very same reason as saola. And a lot of them, we also don't really know a lot about their status, just like saola. So all the effort we put into learning about saola in the field and saving it, even if we're too late for saola, just the motivation of that effort can have a lot of benefit for these other species. If nothing else, if we're too late for saola, everything we're doing will teach us how to save large antlered limpjack, which is the next species in line that's, highly threatened. So, this area of the world are Buddhist countries, and as the Buddha said, no effort is wasted.
Grace Vosen mentioned in one of the videos, Why Saola Still Exists, that the end goal is 2.75 million.
Right.
So what's your progress on fundraising this money? What happens if you don't fundraise the whole amount that you will need for doing this intensive research? Then
saola will go extinct.
So you can go there and make it cheaper somehow.
No, we can't, because that's what's been going on for saola was discovered in 1992. So that's what's been going on for 29 years, is trying to save saola through kind of ad hoc partial measures. So the conservation organizations based in Vietnam and Laos, like WCS and WWF, and the governments of Laos and Vietnam, the Vietnamese organizations like Save Vietnam's Wildlife, they've been doing fantastic work. But it's not been enough, because there hasn't been one organization just focused on saving saola. Like, there's whole organizations focused on saving rhino. There's whole organizations, Panthera, focused on saving large cats. There's whole organizations focused on saving elephants. None of these are as threatened with extinction as saola. Saola needs an entire program focused. So, and I was part of that. All of our organizations, we tried to save saola in the wild to start, improving the patrolling and the protection working with the governments of Vietnam to improving the protection. The problem is the poaching has been going up at a much faster, steeper rate than the increase in levels of protection. So the protection hasn't been able to catch up to the poaching. And because of that, saola is on its way to extinction. So if we just continue trying to go with kind of half partial measures, we've already seen in 29 years that's a path for saola to extinction. So the Saola Foundation, we must raise $2 million for this intensive 2-year search. If we don't raise that, saola is going to go extinct, because we will have failed to find the last ones to put them in the captive breeding center. At least that's my belief. We might get really lucky and somebody bumps into a few male and female saolas and some snares somewhere, but I think the chances of that are 0.000001% of finding enough saolas by accident that are actually in good enough shape to get into a captive breeding center. So, for example, the saola you mentioned in Laos in 2010, it was found by villagers in their snare. They'd heard about the conservation awareness activities by the Lao government and WCS and the saola working group. So they didn't kill it. They built a little fence, a little pen in the forest, and they released it in this pen, and they sent word immediately to the government. The team from the government got up there a day later. They arrived at nighttime. They took some photographs of the animal, and it was dead the next morning. It was too late. The villagers, I talked to them later. I went up to that village and talked to them, and I talked to the villagers who had set the snares. And they said, when we found it, we estimated it had already been in the snare for 3 days. So 3 days in a snare, no water, no food, all that stress. It was the best wildlife veterinarian in the world, probably couldn't have saved that saola. So even if you find a saola, just by accident, the chance of it actually surviving and being in good enough shape to survive in a captive breeding center, it's not very good, So no, it's essential to raise this $2 million for the search. And we think saola deserves it. Saola's had part-time conservation. It's an incredibly beautiful animal, does no harm to anybody, just walking around the forest. It's been on the planet for probably, it's estimated it's been a species for about 8 million years. And within 20 years, humans are on the brink of having it disappear. So I think $2 million isn't too much to ask from 7.5 billion people on planet Earth to save this saola.
But now it's much more about fundraising, right? So how are you doing it?
We're looking for 20 individuals or 20 institutions to each contribute $50,000. And if they do that, we will have the $1 million for the first year search, and we will start searching for saola immediately.
So you need to target some really rich people, right? And how to get to them?
Or just moderately rich people. Yeah. So I think it's going to be, because if you look at the economic downturn of the pandemic, so a very important supporter to saola conservation has been zoos of the world. To show their visitors that they're also contributing to conservation of animals in the wild, not just, keeping animals at the zoo. And like zoos in the Czech Republic have been fantastic in supporting saola conservation. Prague Zoo and Liberec Zoo and Zlin and Ostrava and Pilsen Zoo most recently. But zoos have been really hurt financially by the COVID pandemic. I mean, their visitor numbers are way down. But look at the stock market. Wealthy people have not been hurt by the pandemic at all. Wealthy people are wealthier than they have ever been. The stock market's at a record high. So both private foundations that have their resources invested in equities like the stock market and wealthy individuals, they are better off financially than they've ever been. So we think that just inspiring some of these private foundations or private individuals to get involved in one of the greatest searches for a wild animal in our time is one of the avenues we're pursuing.
So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you so that you can fundraise all this money. And money isn't usually one of the core areas that I talk about in the podcast, but it's important.
It is,
so we had to talk a little bit about it, and now we will talk more about how you want to find saola. So finding saola is hard because there are only a few saolas left, and no one really knows how saola footprints look like, so it's hard to track them. And even if anyone knew how they look like, the footprints and dung disappear really quickly in the wet forest. They are gone within a few days. So how do you want to find saola?
We absolutely know that some of the villagers who are really expert hunters, some of them can absolutely know a saola hoofprint from other things. We know this. You'll also meet people in the village who say they know the difference, but don't really know the difference. And we don't know how to tell the difference between those two people. So this is much more complex. If we were searching for tigers or elephants or bears, there's no mistaking. You can go into a forest in Laos for a few days walking around. You'll know if there are tigers or elephants or bears there because their signs are unmistakable. Saola is very different, as you said. So what we have to do is just get better at finding saola more quickly. And part of the reason, like you said, there hasn't been any records of saola for a while. One reason is that for 2 years when I was with the saola working group, we put all of our focus for more than 2 years in finding saola by searching for their DNA in the blood of leeches. Leeches are these small vertebrates who, suck your blood. And they're all over the Annamite Mountains. And some biologists in Denmark at the Copenhagen National Museum and some saola working group members kind of hatched this idea of, well, maybe you can find saola DNA in the blood of a leech. And it looked very promising to start. That this was a way to find saolas, collect leeches, and then do a DNA test of the blood. And we put all of our search resources into this for 2 years. The entire kind of saola community did. And at the end, it turned out to be a technical dead end. So the geneticists really wanted this to work because it was such a cool genetic tool. But it was the geneticists who said after more than 2 years, said, look, we may have the technology to find a little bit of saola DNA in this saola soup of, because you have to blend a lot of leeches. You collect 500, blend them all, one at last fed on the saola. They said, we can't see a little fragment of DNA in this intense DNA soup right now. Another 5 years, we may have the technology, but you need to go back to something else. So one reason people haven't seen a camera trap photograph is we weren't doing much camera trapping for more than 2 years recently. We're all picking up leeches, and that turned out to be a technological dead end. So camera trapping is not the way to go. Leeches are not the way to go. The Saola Foundation has developed it's a three-pronged approach. Because the key is also, it's not just finding a saola. It's not just about getting one camera trap of a saola, photo of a saola. It's how do we find saola that we can find them again and find them in a way that they can be safely captured and find enough of them. You need at least one male and one female. This much I know with my degree in zoology. So what we're going to do is we're going to train dogs to find saola signs, and that could be saola dung. We also know that saola scent mark, they have a massive gland on the side of their muzzle that they can flare open like an awning, and they scent mark with this. So they're going through the forest scent marking this, and that's probably leaving DNA behind. So that's another sign for saola. So it's feces, it's dung. And we're confident we can train dogs to find this. So that's one leg, finding the saola signs. In the past, we did try to collect what we thought was saola dung, but then you have to send it out to a laboratory. And then you have to get permission to export it. And then it has to go to the laboratory and they have to do the test. And so sometimes we wouldn't get a result back for like 3 months. Well, that's only telling us where a saola was 3 months ago. It's not telling us where a saola is now. So that it was only, partially helpful. The Wildlife Conservation Society in New York and others, they've been working on the development of rapid field DNA test kits. So you find something that you think might have come from a saola, and it's a PCR polymerase, rapid test, that you can get an answer within an hour in the forest. So we've been working, we have a partnership with the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York on developing a saola specific rapid field DNA test kit. So, and then the third leg is we've been working with international wildlife trackers based in, I believe, South Africa. Cyber Tracker is one organization. And we're going to pair them with the really good hunters in the village and develop a top-notch human tracking team. So the sequence is you go out with the dogs, and there's a really good organization based in Laos called Free the Bears, and they have a facility in central Laos with all sorts of resources and facilities. We're going to work with them in training dogs to find saola scent, or saola sign, like dung. You find the dung, you do a rapid DNA test kit with it. If within an hour that was actually a saola, then the human tracking team comes in and they start tracking the saola through the forest. And what they do from that is, then you learn really what saola sign looks like the hoof prints, what they really look like, what the feeding sign looks like, because this is a confirmed saola, what the dung looks like. And it then becomes much easier to find the next saola. Also, you start learning, how big is the home range size of a saola? If it's very small, maybe they can be captured by, you just put up a net in the forest in that area and you can drive the saola into a net. I mean, it opens up the possibilities of how to safely capture them.
How can you tell for sure that saola is extinct? For example, you will be searching for 2 years and at the end of that search you will not find saola. So does it mean that it's extinct, or? If
at the end of the 2-year search we haven't found saolas in a way that we can capture enough, even like 2 or 3, then the world will have to have a conversation. Okay, are we done now? And now, as you say, I think the decision will be made is, okay, now we invest resources in saving something else. We gave saola its best shot. We couldn't find them in a way to allow them to be captured. So now everybody at the Saola Foundation, we will now shift to the second half of our name for Annamite Mountains Conservation, and pour our resources into saving the next animals in line in the Annamite Mountains, which are in time to save. Because as the way you look at it, the critically endangered large antlered muntjac, its status now is probably about what saolas was in about 1995. There would have been time to do exactly what we're doing now for saola in 1995. You could have easily found enough and captured them for a conservation breeding program. Yeah, it's too late now. It's not too late for large antlered muntjac, but it will be too late for large antlered muntjac in 10 years.
What would you like to establish a new nature reserve or protect one animal across this whole area? What's the plan?
So, and I'd like to talk about, there's actually an exciting new model that's being introduced now in Laos through another new organization called Asian Arcs. So the situation is, Veronica, is, the pressure is so high on the Annamites, and things have already been hammered in a lot of places. If all the organizations working on conservation, if everybody tries to save all the wildlife over all of the Annamites, we will lose it all. There aren't enough conservation resources. The effort would be spread too thin to save anything anywhere. Mm-hmm. What is needed is a core zone approach where you focus on whatever the number is, 5 or 6 really key landscapes in Vietnam and in Laos, and you get most organizations to focus on saving those 5 or 6 landscapes. Because if you pick those, whatever the number is, 4, 5, 6, 7 landscapes, and you can really get protection going in those areas, you will save almost everything in the Annamites. You will save viable populations of large antlered muntjac and red-shanked Duke langur and white-cheeked gibbon and a lot of the rare box turtles and pangolins. You will save viable populations of them all. Right now, there isn't a single safe population of any of these animals anywhere in the Annamites because the available effort is being spread too thin. So number one, it has to be a core zone approach. Number two, we're going to have to try something different. The protected area management that's been tried so far, it hasn't worked. There is no protected area. Probably there might be one in Vietnam. There's a group called Viet Nature, and they're doing sort of the model that I'm talking about in an area of Vietnam, and they're doing some really good work. There's another new international organization that's been started called Asian Arcs, and this was actually co-founded by the guy who co-founded the Saola Working Group, Simon Hedges. He co-founded it with a woman with long experience in Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia, Dr. Hannah O'Kelly. And what they're replicating in Southeast Asia is a model that's more common in Africa, where you take over private management of a protected area. And you actually get a concession to manage the protected area, and you hire your own rangers, do your own training, schedule your own patrols. And what Simon and Hannah, they came up with the idea of going to the Lao government about Kunze no Ma. We kind of helped point them to Kunze no Ma because it's so important. And basically the message to the Lao government is, look, you give out concessions to areas for logging. You can get a 20-year concession to log an area or a 20-year concession to plant rubber in a forest area. Could we get a concession to do conservation and ecotourism in this area for, 50 or 100 years? And we will pay you for the concession rights to the core area of Kunze no Ma, and then we'll manage it. We'll do all the management. And we would like to manage it for ecotourism and conservation. And to get ecotourism, of course, we have to save all the animals. So we're going to develop our own privately paid Lao, drawn from the Lao villagers to do the patrolling and save the wildlife. And we'll pay you for the concession to do this. So I think this is a really promising model. So it's still in partnership with the Lao government. It's just a little bit of different model. It's a concession from the Lao government to do conservation. Like they give concessions to do resource extraction, why not a concession to save what's there? So this is a very, I think, a promising model and possibly the way forward in Laos and Vietnam. And then you just apply this to the most important core landscapes of the Annamite Mountains. Then you have a chance to save everything, for the long term.
Thank you so much for the interview. I wish you good luck in finding saola and also conserving other threatened species in the Annamite Mountains. So keep up the good work.
Veronica, thank you so much for your time and for doing this. We really appreciate it. This is what saola needs, is just a bit more attention. And we'll get there. So thank you very much.
If you'd like to know more about saola and the work of Saola Foundation for Annamite Mountains Conservation, go to the website saolafoundation.org. Thanks so much for listening and caring about nature. If you'd like to hear more stories like these, subscribe to Nature Solutionaries podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. See you next time.